This is when Gen X ruled the multiplex, the films that shaped the MTV generation. The 1970s saw the arrival of blockbuster horror films, with 1973's The Exorcist and 1975's Jaws, both of which were huge box office successes that appealed to mainstream audiences instead of just to horror buffs. The 1980s took that a step further with 1984's Gremlins, which was a horror film and a big box office success, but was also a comedy that was designed to appeal to children as much as to adults. Gremlins was directed by Joe Dante, then known for the horror films Piranha and The Howling. It was written by Chris Columbus, who at the time only had one credit to his name, the 1984 romantic comedy Reckless. Columbus also wrote the screenplays for The Goonies and Young Sherlock Holmes, both of which were released in 1985, before successfully transitioning to the director's chair with 1987's Adventures in Babysitting. He'd go on to direct Home Alone 2, Mrs. Doubtfire, and a pair of Harry Potter films. Gremlins was executive produced by Steven Spielberg through his production company, Amblin Entertainment. If you look closely, you can catch Spielberg in a quick cameo riding a recumbent bicycle through a scene. In Chinatown, in an unnamed city, an inventor named Rand Peltzer searches for a Christmas present for his son. A young boy leads him down a dark staircase to his grandfather's shop, which is filled with curiosities. Rand Peltzer is played by folk singer Hoyt Axton, known for writing many hit songs throughout the 60s and 70s, including Three Dog Night's Joy to the World. That's the Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog one, not the And Heaven and Nature Sing one, in case there was any confusion. The small boy's grandfather, Mr. Wing, is played by Key Luke, the original Kato in the 1939 Green Hornet series. While in the shop, Peltzer hears strange animal noises. He investigates and discovers a small creature in a cage, which we the viewers do not yet see. The grandson explains that the creature is known as a Mogwai. Peltzer insists on purchasing the creature, but Mr. Wing refuses, claiming that great responsibility comes with owning a Mogwai. Mr. Wing's grandson secretly makes a deal to sell the creature to Peltzer. He tells him there are 3 rules he must follow: keep the Mogwai out of sunlight, keep him away from water, and most importantly, never feed him after midnight. Meanwhile, in the bucolic small town of Kingston Falls, Peltzer's teen son, an aspiring comic book artist named Billy, tries to start his creaky and temperamental VW bug on a snowy December day. He's helped out by a neighbor, Mr. Futterman, who is played by the late character actor Dick Miller. Billy Peltzer is played by Zach Galligan, best known for this role. Billy walks to work accompanied by his very good dog Barney. If Kingston Falls gives you a sense of déjà vu, that's because Kingston Falls is also Back to the Future's Hill Valley. Both films were shot on the Universal Studios backlot. Billy shows up for his job at the bank, where he flirts with his pretty coworker Kate, who is played by Phoebe Cates, everyone's 1980s teen crush for her role in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. A wealthy and horrible lady named Mrs. Deagle comes into the bank to yell at Billy because his dog broke her prized porcelain snowman. Taking a cue from Elmira Gulch in The Wizard of Oz, she insists Billy surrender his dog so she can have him put to sleep. Mrs. Deagle is played by Polly Holliday, known for playing the sassy waitress Flo of the popular catchphrase "Kiss My Grits" on the mid-70s sitcom Alice. Billy's snobby and sleazy boss Gerald is played by another Fast Times at Ridgemont High alumnus, Judge Reinhold, who would appear in 1984's top-grossing hit Beverly Hills Cop. Gerald and Billy meet at a bar where Kate, who is a bank clerk by day, is working nights as a bartender. In this bar, there's a quick cameo from legendary cartoonist Chuck Jones, co-creator of Bugs Bunny and many other beloved Warner Brothers characters, playing an artist who gives Billy feedback on his latest comic sketches. Billy comes home and chats with his mom, who is played by Frances Lee McCain, whom we have also seen playing Kevin Bacon's mom in Footloose and Leah Thompson's mom in Back to the Future. Rand Peltzer returns from his business trip and gives Billy a gift-wrapped Mogwai, whom he has named Gizmo. Gizmo is fuzzy and adorable, with huge eyes and big ears and a tiny body. It makes a series of cute little noises, which are voiced by Howie Mandel. When the popular stuffed robotic toy Furby was introduced in 1998, Warner Brothers successfully sued Hasbro for infringing on Gizmo's design. Rand tells his wife and son the 3 rules for handling Gizmo. Billy quickly forms a bond with Gizmo, who is lovable and sweet-natured. The Peltzer Christmas tree is delivered by a young neighbor, Pete, who is played by Corey Feldman in one of his earliest roles, before going on to teen fame with big roles in The Goonies, Stand By Me, and The Lost Boys. Pete hangs out with Billy and meets Gizmo. He accidentally splashes water on Gizmo, and Gizmo shoots off little balls of fur from his back that quickly develop into baby Mogwai. The new Mogwai are more obnoxious and brazen than Gizmo, and they quickly cause chaos in the Peltzer household. Billy wakes in the middle of the night to find poor Barney outside in the snow, mysteriously tangled up in Christmas lights. Suspecting this was the work of terrible Mrs. Deagle, Rand offers to take Barney to stay with Billy's grandmother. Billy takes the Mogwai to his science teacher, Mr. Hansen, who is played by Glenn Turman, whose decades-spanning career has included regular roles on Peyton Place, A Different World, and The Wire, and who used to be married to Aretha Franklin. Billy leaves a Mogwai with Mr. Hansen to observe. At the bar, Kate escorts out a drunk Mr. Futterman, who mutters nonsense about his belief in gremlins, magical little creatures who sabotage machinery and cause chaos, which apparently was a common superstition during World War II, particularly among Royal Air Force pilots. Roald Dahl wrote a book in 1943 titled The Gremlins, which was all about these small creatures, and which was probably an inspiration for this film. Billy and Kate walk home together, and Billy asks her on a date. Back at the Peltzer home, while Gizmo is well-behaved and polite, the other Mogwai are unruly and rude and demand to be fed. Billy feeds them, thinking it's still early in the evening. It turns out the Mogwai have eaten through the cord of his clock, and it is, in fact, after midnight. The Mogwai left with Mr. Hansen steals a leftover sandwich and eats it after midnight. In the morning, all the Mogwai, with the exception of Gizmo, have turned into scaly, goo-covered cocoons. At the school, Mr. Hansen tells Billy and Pete that the Mogwai have entered a pupal state and are undergoing a metamorphosis. Mr. Hansen's Mogwai emerges from his cocoon and becomes some kind of fast-moving creature that we, the viewers, don't get to see yet, while at the Peltzer home, the remaining Mogwai have made the same transformation. Mr. Hansen calls Billy to alert him. When Billy arrives at the school, he finds Mr. Hansen has been murdered by the evolved Mogwai, otherwise known as a gremlin. Billy is ambushed by the gremlin, which flees into the air vents and disappears. Back at the Peltzer home, the gremlins attack poor Gizmo. Billy calls his mom to tell her to get out of the house, but the gremlins disconnect the phone line. For the first time, we get to see the gremlins, and they are big-eyed, big-eared, scaly, clawed, mean little creatures. The gremlins stalk Mrs. Peltzer around the house. She comes across one making a mess in the kitchen and kills it in a very messy way by sticking it in a high-powered blender. She stabs another one to death and sticks a third in the microwave to make it explode into a bloody pulp. Mrs. Peltzer is this film's MVP on the strength of her behavior in this scene, in which she interrupts her holiday cookie decorating to become a one-woman knife-wielding gremlin extermination machine. In an early draft of the script, apparently the gremlins kill Mrs. Peltzer and throw her decapitated head down the stairs, which I'm sure glad they didn't go with that approach, because Mrs. Peltzer is too good of a character to meet that end. A fourth gremlin goes to town on the Christmas tree and gets the upper hand on Mrs. Peltzer. Billy rushes in, grabs a sword that happens to be hanging on the wall, and decapitates the gremlin, sending its severed head flying into the fireplace. The last remaining gremlin, dubbed Stripe due to his distinctive white mohawk, takes off into the night. Billy stuffs Gizmo into his backpack and heads after him. He trails Stripe to the local YMCA, where Stripe splashes around in the swimming pool, getting himself soaking wet and giving birth to dozens of horrible little gremlins. Billy tries to report this to Sheriff Frank, who is played by Scott Brady, and Deputy Brent, who is played by Breaking Bad's Jonathan Banks, whom we have also seen in The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. They mock Billy for his outlandish tale of beastly little creatures, but then emergency calls start pouring in about gremlin-orchestrated acts of destruction. The gremlins terrorize the citizens of Kingston Falls. They steal Mr. Futterman's tractor and drive it into his house. It sure looks like the gremlins kill Futterman and his wife, but they'll both be alive for the sequel, 1990's Gremlins 2, The New Batch, so we should feel free to assume they're fine. Gremlins rewire the traffic lights to cause chaos. They also pose as Christmas carolers to menace Mrs. Deagle, whom Stripe ultimately kills by rewiring her electric stairlift to send her flying out the window to her doom. Gremlins hang out in Kate's bar, boozing it up and making a mess while indulging in such quintessential 80s activities as arcade games, poker, and breakdancing. Realizing the gremlins are highly sensitive to light, Kate zaps a few using the flash of a Polaroid camera. The gremlins attack, but she's saved by the arrival of Billy and Gizmo. While hiding out in a gremlin-ravaged home, Kate confesses to Billy that she doesn't celebrate Christmas because her father disappeared on Christmas Eve when she was 9, and his body was found several days later wedged in the chimney dressed as Santa Claus. Billy and Kate wander through the suspiciously quiet town center, where they discover all the gremlins holed up in the movie theater watching Snow White. Billy blows up the theater and kills them all, except for Stripe, who is in a department store. Stripe stalks Billy throughout the store, hurling saw blades at him and shooting crossbow bolts, and menacing him with a chainsaw. Stripe goes for a swim in the garden department's fountain with the intention of creating more gremlins. Gizmo opens up a skylight, and Stripe is destroyed in the light of the rising sun. On Christmas morning, as Kingston Falls slowly recovers, news reports blame the chaos on mass hysteria. Mr. Wing shows up at the Peltzer home to take Gizmo back because the Peltzers have comprehensively demonstrated they can't handle caring for a Mogwai. Fair enough, they could hardly have handled it worse. They broke every single one of those 3 rules. Gizmo bids Billy a wistful farewell before leaving with Mr. Wing. Gremlins received a PG rating from the MPAA, which is something that makes me blink in astonishment just a bit, because Gremlins is a very violent film, with a high death toll of both gremlins and humans. By and large, viewers and critics in 1984 shared my astonishment, and there was a bit of an outcry about that level of violence in a PG-rated film. Gremlins, along with 1984's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, is a big reason for the creation of the PG-13 rating, which fell in between the PG, parental guidance, and R, restricted ratings. This came about after a suggestion to the MPAA by Steven Spielberg, who of course played a big part in both films. Way back in my analysis of Valley Girl, I touched on the creation of the PG-13 rating to explain why teen films made after 1984 no longer had boobs in them. A somewhat more important effect of the PG-13 rating is that it softened the border between films made for kids and films made for adults. This was a boon for the studios, since films that appeal to all ages have the biggest possible audience to draw upon, and thus are often very profitable. It's no coincidence that the vast majority of the top-grossing films of all time are rated PG-13. As violent as it is, Gremlins was designed for an audience of all ages. In fact, it's very much a family-friendly Christmas romp, albeit one that's pretty bloody. It's a comedy, and often a very broad and slapsticky one, with lots of kid-friendly jokes and sight gags. Made on a relatively lean budget, Gremlins was a big box office hit. It was the fourth highest grossing film of 1984, coming in behind such box office juggernauts as Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Ghostbusters, and Beverly Hills Cop. Zach Galligan and Phoebe Cates are cute and bubbly as teen lovebirds Billy and Kate, and the supporting cast, Hoyt Axton and Frances Lee McCain and Corey Feldman, and Key Luke is great. And Gremlins has that irresistible story hook, adorable furry creatures who transform into the stuff of nightmares. The premise has the feeling of a fairy tale with those 3 magical rules that must be followed, which is a cool twist in a horror film in a contemporary setting. The script is often very funny as well as gross and scary, and it's filled with quirky little touches like Rand Peltzer's various inventions that never work quite as well as expected. But as the first family-friendly horror comedy hybrid produced by a big-name producer for a major Hollywood studio, Gremlins essentially created a new subgenre. And while it does a good job of staking out this new virgin territory, it doesn't quite stick the landing. The pacing is often awkward. The first half of the film unfolds at a very pleasant and leisurely pace, and then the second half, after the Mogwai turn into gremlins, devolves into loud and borderline nonsensical chaos. And then there's a part where Gizmo drives a toy car around a department store for what seems like 8 million years. And the tone is often hard to figure out. Watch Kate's monologue to Billy about how her father died in the chimney while dressed up as Santa Claus, and try to decide if you're meant to find it funny or sad. I'm genuinely uncertain what the filmmakers intended viewers to feel, because while the idea is sort of hilariously macabre, as the scene plays out, it seems too silly to seem tragic, and yet not clever enough to really work as a great bit of dark comedy. That horror-comedy balance can be a tricky one, especially if you're trying to keep things gentle enough for small kids, and there are moments in the film, like Kate's story about her dad, where you can sense that the filmmakers are trying to do something offbeat, but not quite making it work. I will point out, though, that Kate's story about her dad is a moment everybody remembers from the film, whether you love it or hate it, and Joe Dante and Steven Spielberg pushed hard to have that scene kept in above the objections of the studio heads. So your reaction to it really is going to boil down to a matter of personal taste. The success of Gremlins means it spawned a bunch of imitators, including Critters, Ghoulies, and Troll. More interesting than any of those, though, is its official sequel, 1990's Gremlins 2, The New Batch, which was also directed by Dante and starred Galligan and Cates, but which was otherwise an entirely different beast from the original. An entertaining and unruly, fourth-wall-breaking parody of the entire idea of making a Gremlins sequel, Gremlins 2 is both a total mess and totally awesome. And with only a few reservations, I'd say the same applies to the original. Next time, I am looking for an answer to the eternal holiday question. Is Die Hard a Christmas movie? The corpse in the Santa hat says yes. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you then.